worker. Amen. Amen. I'm going to read this morning from Mark 5, starting at verse 21. And it says, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come, put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. And he went in and he said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. So after putting them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. You know, there's something when I read through the Gospels that I find really, really interesting. You see, the Gospels are an account that 4 different authors have written about the life of Jesus, about the time when he's been walking this earth from the moment he's born to he rises again. And they write this account of the stories and the things which have taken place, the things which they feel, this is an important thing that I need to pass on. This is something that we need to know about this. But there's something that stands out to me as we're reading this. You see, the Bible tells us that Jesus healed many. It tells us after one of his first miracles when he heals the mother-in-law of Peter, it says that many came to him and were healed of sickness and the demons were cast out. Then it says he traveled to Galilee and he healed many. And then it said he retreated and the crowds followed him and many were healed. And then it says he retreats to a lake and again he heals many. And then he goes up a mountain and he heals many. And on and on and on through the Gospels, we hear that Jesus heals many. So we could safely probably estimate or assume that Jesus in his time healed hundreds, maybe thousands of people as he encountered them and he touched them and he changed them and he spoke to them. They see lives transformed, that he heals many. And yet, as the gospel writers are writing, it's like they're saying Jesus comes and he heals many. All these people were healed and transformed. And then all of a sudden, they say, wait, pause. Jesus has healed many, but I need to tell you about this one. And what is so significant about these specific healings, these specific accounts, that out of all the hundreds, maybe thousands of healings that took place, that this particular person said, I need to tell you about this thing that Jesus said. I need to tell you about this interaction, this miracle, this healing, this thing that took place, this conversation. What is so significant about these ones that Jesus, in his walk, that the disciples have said, wait a second, there's something in this that I need you to know. There's something in this that it's important that we get. And interestingly, this particular account is found in 3 of the 4 Gospels. It's actually in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and there are similarities between the 3 for good reason, but not all of the things in these books are repeated in all 3, sometimes 1, sometimes 2. This is one of the few that is in all 3 of them. There's something so important about this story that all 3 authors felt it was important enough to include. And there's details which are repeated in all 3 of their accounts of it, because there's something in it which is significant for every single person. And as Gary mentioned, today is the first of a series of 7 weeks when we're going to look at meeting Jesus. We're going to look at some of the encounters, some of the miracles that Jesus performed, some of the things that happened. But let's not take them for granted, because they're in here because there's something significant about these that God wants to speak to us through, that God wants to bring transformation through. They're the zoom-in moments, they're the highlight moments, they're the pause moments in which there's something significant that God wants to communicate to us that we need to hear. This story in particular is a rare one because it's a tale of 2 stories. And in all 3 accounts, both of these stories are included. Now, they're obviously a tale of 2 stories because they did happen together, but there's something really, really fundamentally important about these 2 stories together which tell us something significant about who Jesus is and what is important to him. And we find this in these 2 people. We're introduced to 2 people. We're introduced to a man named Jairus, and we're introduced to a woman who we are not given her name. And there's things about them which are extremely different, and there's things about them which are similar. And it's in these differences and in these similarities we find really important things that they're trying to be communicated as they're writing these accounts. The first thing is in that very thing. The first thing is the fact that we are given Jairus' name. Now, I find it really, really interesting. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but if you read through the gospel accounts, it's actually quite rare that we're given people's names. That we hear about the man who was blind, born blind. We hear about the lepers. We hear about the man who was crippled from birth. We hear about the woman who washed Jesus' feet with her hair. We hear about the Samaritan woman by the well. We hear about all these people, and we're told details about them, but we're not given their names. And then you hear about others, and there's these people where names are given. There's something significant in the fact that we are given Jairus' name, but we are not given this woman's name. You see, Jairus is a man of distinction. He's a man of note. He's a man that people would know and would understand. There's a man that's seen. He is a synagogue leader who is a leader within his community. He's considered a righteous man, a good man. He's a man set apart in the eyes of the community. He's a man of wealth. And on the other hand, we have this woman who we don't even know her name. She's considered naturally so insignificant that we're not even told what her name is. Not only that, is she's an outcast. Not only that, is by her very condition of being, of the sickness that she has, she would have been completely a pariah in her community. As a woman, she was low down on the social status. As somebody that was sick, she was even lower down on the social status. As a woman who is destitute, because it says she spent all of the money, she spent everything that she has to try and get better. She has no wealth. She is in the lowest social standing that you can possibly get, to the point where her name seems insignificant. By the very fact that she's been unwell for this length of time means that she would have had no connection or communication with her family and friends. And yet here we hear of Jairus, who is surrounded by family, surrounded by friends, by servants. He's surrounded by people and connection and community, and this woman has nobody. She's over here alone and by herself. The author is drawing this distinction of two completely different people. This man is respected. This woman is dismissed and avoided at all costs. But there's something even more significant about the fact that they've highlighted that Jairus is a synagogue leader, because he's trying to build a picture about what naturally in society and community people see about these two people. Because not only that, is how society perceive their acceptance before God. Because you see, Jairus as a synagogue leader is not only accepted into the temple, he's expected to be in the temple. He's expected to belong in the house of God. He's expected to be walking those halls. He's welcomed with open arms, that the doors will be flung open. He's a synagogue leader. He's a righteous person. He's supposed to be here. If you're looking for him, that's where you go to find him. He's accepted in this place. Yet one of the things about this woman is she would not be allowed inside the temple. She would not be allowed inside the courts of God. She would not be allowed in that place that is symbolic of the presence of God. She would not be allowed there. That a woman in her monthly cycle, she would not be allowed in the temple until the end of that time. Anything that she touched, sat on, lay on, if you touched it, you became unclean. She was not allowed in the temple if she was unclean. She had been visibly seen as unclean for 12 years. For 12 years, she was not even allowed to step foot inside the temple. And here they're painting a picture of these two completely different people and how their society saw them. And yet, as they paint the picture, you see the similarities. And I find it really, really interesting that in all three accounts that there's certain details. This is the most detailed account. The other two in Matthew and Luke, the accounts just the same story but shorter, but details that are included still in all of them is they highlight the fact that the woman has been ill for 12 years, and they highlight the fact that Jairus' daughter was 12 years old. They're building a picture of a similarity, a similar thread between the two of them. And so here we have a tale of two stories. But Jairus is this man who is wealthy and accepted and established, but he's actually, amazingly, he's part of an establishment that is hostile to Jesus. We are reading in the gospel that the synagogue leaders rejected Jesus. They were against Jesus. They did not want him anywhere near anything. They were the ones who were trying to build up a case against Jesus. He's part of an establishment that wants nothing to do with Jesus. And here he is as a man who is desperate. He's a man who's used to people coming to him for help. He's a man who's respected. He's a man who is at this place where his friends and social situation and surroundings are hostile to Jesus over here, and yet he is so desperate that he wants to see his daughter healed. But you know what I find really, really fascinating about Jairus is he was in this place where he was so willing, so desperate, so willing, that he was prepared to humble himself to see that miracle take place. And he only did that because he had faith to believe that Jesus could actually heal his daughter. Here's a man of a social setting that is against Jesus, and yet he believes that this man, Jesus, could heal his daughter. That level of faith. And to that point, he's willing to come. And I find it so interesting that he doesn't send a servant to Jesus. He probably naturally would have sent a servant, go and get that Jesus on the hush-hush down low so none of my friends know about it. And just kind of bring him around the back door and we'll see if he can maybe pray for my daughter. I mean, that's the way that I would think somebody in that situation might behave, but he doesn't. He's at the point of so much faith and humility. He goes in the middle of a crowd of people by himself on his own, this proud, respected synagogue leader of the community. And everybody thinks Jesus, in his social circle, thinks Jesus is really like a bad person, a bad name. And here he is, and he throws himself on his knees before Jesus and practically begs him, "My daughter is dying, please. Would you come? Can you heal her, please? Can you come?" The humility, the faith in this man. And Jesus, of course, it doesn't matter any of that stuff. Jesus is, of course, I'll come. Let me come with you and see your daughter. But then it's almost like that story is interrupted. And they're like, let's introduce this other character for a minute. This unnamed woman. A woman on the lowest possible social scale. She has tried every means necessary to get healing. She has no other choices or options. And she hears about this man. This holy man who can heal. You see, Jairus was willing to risk everything on his side. He was willing to risk his reputation. He was willing to risk his friends. He was willing to probably risk his position in the synagogue. He was willing to risk everything for one touch of help from Jesus. And here's a woman who has something very different to risk. You see, for a woman or a person who was unwell or considered unclean, if she was to walk down the street, she was supposed to shout, "Unclean, I'm unclean," so that everybody around her would know. Because if anybody touched her, they would become unclean too. And so everywhere she went, she was supposed to announce her shame. She was supposed to announce her condition. Everywhere she went, she'd be rejected by every single person. She'd walk in the street and people would run the opposite direction. They would run the other way. They would avoid her at all costs. She was supposed to do this. Now, I don't know what was going through her mind in that moment. But she was like, there's a man who might be able to help me. So she risks everything. She pushes through the crowd. I would not like to know how many people she touched. She pushes through this crowd, not to let people know who she is or where she is or what she's doing. She sneaks through, bumping into everybody, just to touch Jesus's cloak, the end of Jesus's garment. Why? Because she's like, I have the faith to believe he can heal me. But she's terrified that if she lets him know who she is, he won't touch her, he won't heal her. And so she grasps the end, just sneakily, I'll touch him to be healed. And instantly, she knows the healing. She's willing to risk everything of a different nature. See, both sides of this spectrum, humility, faith, risking it all to get one touch from Jesus. Now, the woman with blood, issue of blood, she's healed. It says that she instantly knows she's healed, that the bleeding stops. She knows that she is. And Jesus knows that somebody has received healing. This is another thing which I find interesting, because Jesus turns around in the middle of all of this chaos. Everybody's touching him. Everybody's bumping against him. The disciples have a good point in all of that. And he turns around and he says, who touched me? Now, if I'm honest, I don't think Jesus was unaware of who touched him. Jesus is God. Jesus knows all. Jesus, in other parts of the Bible, discerns people's thoughts, discerns people's actions, knows what's going on. I don't think that Jesus wasn't aware of who touched him. I think Jesus wasn't calling her out to admit that she was there for his benefit. He wasn't like, I feel something coming out of some healing coming out of me. Who touched me over here? I need to know who touched me. I don't think Jesus is asking this question for his benefit. He's asking it for her benefit. He's asking it for the benefit of the people around about her. Who touched me? And the woman has a choice. It says that she's trembling with fear. I mean, she suddenly realized, hang on a minute, this wasn't so secret. I couldn't just like slip in and slip out. He knows. The fear that she was feeling because she was going to have to admit that she had broken every law there was. And this holy, special, precious man that she's heard, rabbi that she's heard so much about, she's going to have to admit that her unclean, lowest class person touched him when she wasn't supposed to, and she's just made him unclean. She's just made everybody around her unclean. She's going to have to admit it. She's terrified. What is he going to say? What is his reaction going to be? And so here she is with trembling and fear, and she falls on her knees before him, and she says she admits everything. She tells him the whole story. And Jesus is delighted because everybody gets to hear this story. If she hadn't done that, if Jesus hadn't paused to call her out, we would not know today that that had even happened, most likely. But how does Jesus respond? This woman who has come before him, who's here in this situation, how does Jesus respond? What is the reason? What is the reason that he got her to come forward? He says to her, daughter. He says to her, daughter. This woman who has been rejected, this woman who's been abandoned, this woman who hasn't had any relational connection or any kind of family or anything around about her for so long, he calls her out and he says, you're my daughter. And he says, go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And he says, you have great faith. What is he doing in this moment? You see, sometimes we come to Jesus, when we come to this point, we come to Jesus with our need. How many times have you done it? You say, God, if you just do this one thing, I'll be happy. God, this thing that is so big, this thing that I'm struggling with, this thing in my home, this thing in my workplace, this thing in this relationship, this health thing, this thing that's going on in my life, if you just do this one thing, God, please, this one thing is great. So Jesus is saying this morning, he's saying, yes, I'll do that thing, but then I want to do more. I don't just want to heal you physically. I want to restore you. I want you to know your worth. I want you to know that you're not just some person that's nameless. I want you to know that your name now is daughter. You have a name, and that name is my daughter. You have an identity. You have a worth. You have a value. You have an important place. Not only that, I'm letting everybody here know you have something of far more worth than anybody else here, is that you have faith. What I see in you is something so infinitely valuable beyond anything that anybody can imagine. Is you are my child, you are my daughter, you have identity, you have worth, you have faith. And from now on you can go in peace and you can be freed from your suffering. He's not talking about her physical ailment. He's not talking about her physical suffering. He's saying you can be freed from that suffering of loneliness and rejection. You can be freed from that suffering of being an outcast and being on the end fringes of society. Here, right now, I want you to know who you are. I want you to know your worth, and I want everybody else to know your worth. See, we go to Jesus with one thing. Just, God, just do this thing for me, please. And Jesus says, I want to do more. My purpose for you is greater. I see something in you infinitesimally more valuable than what you or anyone else see in you. And I want to call it out, and I want to restore you, and I want to see the transformation in your life. And yet here in this moment, we have Jairus. Man, I want to know what he's thinking in this moment. He's risked it all to go to Jesus for help for his daughter. And he's like, yes, he's coming. My daughter's going to be healed. And then Jesus stops. Now, I'm not a particularly patient person, but I don't think my lack of patience would reach the lack of patience he's feeling in that moment. Jesus, why are you stopping? We're on our way. My daughter's dying. She's over here. Come on. And not only that, he's stopping for, can you come back in 10 minutes? Can't you come back and see her? Let's just go and see my daughter, please. And Jesus is stopping. And not only that, in that moment, the servant comes and says, just don't bother him anymore. Your daughter, she's died. She's gone. It's like, Jesus, see if you just hadn't stopped. See if you just kept coming, maybe we would have made it. So many times, we question God's timing. So many times we're like, God, I asked you for help. Why haven't you helped me? God, why haven't you come? I asked that you would do this thing, and yet it's just all falling apart. God, what is happening? Why didn't you come? What is your timing? And yet, if that's you today, what Jesus said was this thing. He said, don't be afraid. Just believe. And I believe that is for some people this morning, that Jesus says to you today, he says, don't be afraid, just believe. Don't give up. I know naturally it looks like there's nothing that can happen. I know naturally the circumstances would say there's no options and no choices. I know naturally it looks bleak, but today, don't be afraid, just believe, because the one that you've called on for help is the miracle worker, whose timing is perfect. And of course, Jesus goes and the daughter is healed. We have a tale of two stories. And I think sometimes we have a whole host of reasons why we don't bring the needs that we have to Jesus. I think sometimes our pride gets in the way. What will people think if I try Jesus? Things are so hard in my life right now, but what will my friends and family think if I go to Jesus for help? If I go to church, if I pray, if I become a Christian, what will my friends and family think? Sometimes our pride gets in our way simply because to ask Jesus for help, I'm going to have to admit that I'm struggling. I'm going to have to let people see my vulnerability. I'm going to have to let people see that things aren't perfect, and yet I give this illusion that everything's okay. Everybody thinks that I've got it all together. Everybody thinks that everything's okay, and that's comfortable and that's safe. But to go to Jesus for help, I'm going to have to admit that actually I don't have it all together and I've got no hope. What are the things that stop us from going to Jesus? Maybe it's our shame. Maybe it's that we don't feel worthy. Maybe it's like, but I've just messed up too many times. I've asked God for help with that before and I'm back there again. I'm struggling with that issue again. How can I go to God again? Why would Jesus help me? Everybody else has said I'm a failure. Everybody else says I'm worthless. Why would Jesus help me? I've tried everything else. I've tried everything else to help. I've gone to self-help, I've gone to this group, and I've gone to that group, and I've tried this medication, and I've tried that thing and this thing. Why would Jesus help me? Nothing else has worked. There's so many reasons, there's so many things that stop us from going to Jesus with what we need. But today, this encounter, this meeting with Jesus, why was it so important that these gospel writers put it there for us? Because it's saying, look, it doesn't matter your social status. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. It doesn't matter how many avenues you've tried. It doesn't matter what other people say, what people do. If we are willing to come to Jesus and humble ourselves and put our faith and our trust in him, all it takes is just one touch and our lives will be transformed. All it takes is that one moment. All it takes is that one reaching out and saying, I've tried everything else, but I'm just going to try you, Jesus, please. It just takes that one thing where you say, Jesus, come, and he just touches into that situation, and one touch of Jesus, one moment with him, and things can be transformed. But Jesus doesn't want to stop there. He wants to restore us and bring us back, that people can see that none of this other stuff that the world tells us matters. None of these other things that we have in our mind that we think are important to Jesus. All these things that we think make us worthy or unworthy to encounter God mean anything to Jesus. All that matters to him is that we step out in faith and we say, Jesus, will you come? Even if the timing doesn't line up the way I think, even if things go hard, I'm going to continue to not allow fear in and just believe. I'm going to continue to hang on. I'm going to invite the worship team back up, if that's okay, just now. This morning, I don't know all the things that we wrestle with, but what I know is we wrestle with things. We struggle with things. And oftentimes it's those hidden things. Oftentimes it's that we struggle to admit those things that were in our hearts that we're struggling with. Sometimes it's the deeper things of our worth, of our identity. And yet God is a God who wants to meet with us. God is a God who wants that permission to come in and transform and restore and heal. He's not interested in the things that we think are important and others think are important. It doesn't matter today who you are in the world's eyes. In God's sight, we all have worth and value the same. We are all of us created in his image. We are all of us loved by him. We're all of us destined for great things. We're all of us and Jesus wants to stop in the tracks and turn. See who touched me? Who's reaching out to me? Because today, he wants to do a great thing. He wants to speak life and truth over us today. Jesus. So we're going to sing. We're going to worship together. Jesus, the God of miracles. Jesus, the God who restores. Jesus, the one who saves and heals and transforms and forgives and breaks into situations that seem impossible and continues to move when there seems no hope and does what nobody else can do. We're going to stand together and we're going to worship him this morning. And as we do so, as the worship team, as they lead us in worship, I want to ask something that we've not done on a Sunday morning for a while. I want to give you the opportunity that if today you want a touch from Jesus, if there's something in your life that you're like, God, I've tried everything else, Jesus, I choose you. Will you come into the situation? I'm going to invite anybody that wants to come forward as a step of faith. And we're going to pray with you. And the reason I want you to do that is sometimes it's that risk. Sometimes, like the woman, she had to push through and risk all. And when Jesus said, "Who touched me?" she had to step forward. She stepped forward and she said, "Jesus, it was me." And Jairus, in that moment, he came forward and in front of everybody humbled himself and says, "Jesus, I need help." And sometimes it's that humility. Sometimes it's that step of faith. It's not requirement for God to do something, but sometimes it's something in us that needs to happen. That trust, that faith. And so I'm going to invite everybody that is able to stand as we worship together. And just worship God. It's not anything else. We're just going to worship the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We're just going to lift those praises high this morning. But if that's you and you want a touch from Jesus, you need to reach out to Jesus this morning, then come forward. Encourage you to come forward, and we want to pray with you because we believe in a God of miracles. We believe in a God who heals and restores today. We believe in a God who transforms. We believe in a God who brings healing and hope and life and truth and freedom. And that's true. It's true today. It's as true this morning as it was on that day that he met that woman and Jairus on that road. That Jesus can transform. And so this morning we're going to stand together and we're going to worship. And if that's you and you would like us to pray with